Two people, same city, same salary, same $80,000 sitting in the bank. One of them buys a house with it. The other keeps renting and puts the 80 grand in the stock market. 30 years later, you'd expect the homeowner to be the obvious winner. That's the whole story we've all been told. He isn't. Depending on 2 or 3 numbers that nobody on earth can predict in advance, the renter can walk away with 2 or 3 times what the buyer has. Flip those same numbers the other way, and the buyer crushes the renter by $1 million. Same start, same money. Wildly different endings, decided by things neither of them controlled. You've probably had some version of this argument already, with your spouse, with a parent, with a guy at work who won't stop talking about building equity. And almost everything you've been handed on the subject is either half the story or just wrong. So I'm going to run the whole thing for you, start to finish, with today's actual numbers, including the parts that work against the answer I'd lean toward myself. By the end, you'll know the real break-even, why throwing money away on rent is a sloppier phrase than it sounds, and the 2 questions that actually decide this for you, which have almost nothing to do with the housing market. Every rent versus buy breakdown you've ever watched cheats in one of 2 directions. The homeownership crowd leads with the ending. Here's what the house is worth in 30 years. Look at all that equity. Look at this paid-off asset. Case closed. They walk you straight to the finish line and quietly skip everything that happened along the way. The interest, the taxes, the roof, the money that never got invested. The renting crowd does the opposite. They lead with freedom and flexibility, and they pretend that flexibility is free, that there's no long-term price for owning nothing at the end of it. Neither one runs the full number. The full number is messy. It doesn't resolve into a clean winner, and it's terrible content because it won't fit on a thumbnail. But it's the only version that's any use to you, so that's the one we're doing. Let me give them names so this stays concrete. Dan buys, Ray rents. The house is $400,000, which is roughly a normal price for a normal home in a normal American market right now. Dan puts 20% down, $80,000, so he skips the mortgage insurance. He borrows the other $320,000 on a 30-year fixed at 6.5%, which is about what rates actually are as I'm recording this, not the 7 or 8% you might have in your head. His principal and interest come to about $2,020 a month. That's the number the real estate agent shows him. It's also not remotely the real number. Add property taxes, somewhere around $370 a month. Insurance, call it $170. And maintenance, the one everybody pretends doesn't exist, at roughly 1% of the home's value a year, which is another $330 a month. And I'll come back to why that's not optional. All in, Dan's actual monthly cost to own this house is close to $3,000. Ray rents a comparable place down the street for $2,300 a month. He takes the $80,000 he didn't sink into a down payment, plus the $12,000 or so Dan paid in closing costs, and he puts all $92,000 into a plain total market index fund. Every month after that, he invests the difference between what Dan pays to own and what he pays to rent. Right now, that gap is about $700 a month, and it goes into the market too. On paper, Ray looks like he found a cheat code. He's living in basically the same house for $700 a month less, and his money's still liquid, still working. Hold on to that feeling, because it's about to get complicated in both directions. The first thing nobody tells you is that the moment Dan signs, he's not ahead, he's behind, and not by a little. Closing costs on a $400,000 house run somewhere between 2 and 5%. Lender fees, title insurance, an appraisal, prepaid taxes, escrow setup. Call it $12,000 gone on day one before he's built a dollar of equity. That's money that has to be earned back before buying even starts to make sense against renting. Then there's what actually happens inside that mortgage payment in the early years. In month 1 of Dan's roughly $2,000 in principal and interest, about $1,700 is pure interest handed to the bank, Only around 300 goes toward actually owning more of his house. So look at where his money really goes that first year. 1,700 in interest, 370 in tax, 170 in insurance, 330 in maintenance. That's roughly $2,600 a month leaving his pocket and building him nothing. The little sliver going to principal is the only part doing the job people imagine the whole payment is doing. Now sit with the phrase, throwing money away on rent. Ray is throwing away $2,300 a month. Dan, in year one, is throwing away $2,600 a month on costs that build no equity at all, and then putting a bit on top of that into principal. The rent is wasted line survives because it sounds obviously true. Run the actual dollars in the early years, and the buyer is the one setting more money on fire, not less. That reverses eventually, but it takes longer than anyone selling you a house wants you to know. Here's the number that almost never shows up in a home ownership pitch, and it's the biggest one: opportunity cost. Dan's $92,000, the down payment plus closing, is gone from the market the second he wires it to the title company. Ray's $92,000 stays invested. Over 30 years at a normal 8% return, that single upfront chunk, left alone, grows to about $920,000 on its own, almost $1 million, from the money Dan spent just to get his foot in the door. That's not a loss Dan can see, which is exactly why it's dangerous. It never shows up on a statement. There's no bill for it. It's just the other life his money could have lived, and any honest comparison has to count it, because Ray is actually living it. When somebody tells you your home is the best investment you'll ever make, this is the number they forgot to subtract. Told you I'd come back to maintenance, because it's the cost people lie to themselves about the most. On paper, it's a tidy 1% a year. In real life, it doesn't arrive in tidy monthly slices. It arrives in ambushes. Most years are cheap. A couple $100 in caulk and furnace filters and a leaky faucet, and you start to think the whole maintenance worry was overblown. Then year 8 walks in with a $9,000 roof, or the air conditioning dies in July and it's $7,500 to replace, and it is very much not optional because it's 95 degrees in the house. Or the water heater goes, the foundation cracks, a tree root finds the sewer line. Averaged over the long haul, the typical American homeowner spends north of $4,000 a year just keeping the place standing. A homeowner who isn't quietly setting that money aside isn't actually saving anything. He's borrowing time against a bill with no due date printed on it, one that always comes due anyway. Ray, meanwhile, calls the landlord and goes back to his dinner. Before I run the numbers forward, one idea you need, because it's the engine under the whole buying side: leverage. When Dan puts $80,000 down on a $400,000 house, he controls a $400,000 asset with a fraction of the cash. So if that house rises even 4% in a year, he isn't making 4% on his 80 grand. He's making 4% on the entire 400,000, which is a huge return relative to what he actually put in. No normal stock portfolio lets an ordinary person borrow like that. That's the real reason a good housing market can hand a homeowner returns the market can't match. But leverage runs both ways with no mercy. In a bad market, that same force can wipe out his whole down payment while he still owes the bank every penny of the loan. Ray has no leverage and no landmine under him. Dan is standing on both at once. Now let's actually run the two of them forward and see who comes out ahead. I built a full month-by-month model for this. Every payment, appreciation, rent increases, the whole thing. And I want to show you what it spit out, because the answer surprised me. In a middle-of-the-road scenario, the house appreciates around 4% a year, Ray's investments earn about 8%, his rent climbs about 4% a year like rents tend to. The two of them basically tie. At the 10-year mark, Dan's a little ahead, maybe $25,000, once you subtract what it had cost him to sell. By year 30, after his mortgage is gone and Ray's rent has ballooned, Ray edges back ahead by a similar margin. 30 years of one of the biggest financial decisions of your life, and the gap between the two paths is a rounding error, a wash. But that's just one set of assumptions. Watch what happens when I nudge them. Say the market's a little kinder to renters. The house only appreciates 3%. Ray's investments do 10, and he's in a pricier city where rent is cheap relative to home prices. Now it's not close. By year 30, Ray has around $3 million and Dan has under $1 million. The renter wins by $2 million without ever owning a thing. Now flip it. Strong housing market, 5% appreciation, but the stock market only does 7, and Ray's rent is high to begin with. Now Dan runs away with it, closer to $1.7 million in home equity against Ray's $800,000. The buyer wins by nearly $1 million. Same two people, same salaries. The only thing that changed was 3 numbers: how fast houses go up, how fast the market goes up, and how expensive rent is where you live. And not one of those 3 can be known in advance. Anybody who shows you a rent versus buy calculation with a confident winner at the bottom isn't showing you math. They're showing you their guesses about the future, dressed up as math. The real answer to which one wins is that it depends entirely on a future nobody has seen, which sounds like a cop-out until you realize it points you straight at the things you can actually control. And those turn out to matter more than the housing market anyway. The whole rent and invest case, the one that has Ray ending up with $3 million, rests on 4 quiet words that everybody skips right past: if he actually invests. Every analysis showing renting beat buying assumes the renter takes that $700 monthly difference and the $92 grand and puts every cent of it into the market and leaves it there for 30 years through every crash without flinching. On a spreadsheet, that's automatic. In a human life, it almost never happens. Here's what real people do with the money they save by renting. They don't invest it. They upgrade the apartment. They take the trip. They lease the nicer car because they can. Because the money's just sitting there in checking and life is expensive and the market feels scary the exact week they were going to put it in. When there's a gap between what you could spend and what you should invest, most people quietly spend it. Not because they're foolish, because that's how almost everyone is wired. And this is the part that flips the whole thing back toward buying for ordinary people. A mortgage is forced savings. Every single month, whether you feel like it or not, a chunk of that payment builds your equity, because the alternative is losing the house. There's no willpower involved. You don't have to be disciplined. The bank makes you do the responsible thing on autopilot, and 30 years later, you own a house whether you were good with money or not. You can see the fingerprints of this in the raw numbers. The median homeowner in America has a net worth north of $390,000. The median renter has around $10,000. That gap is enormous, and I have to be honest with you about it. A big part of it isn't the house making people rich. It's that the people who buy houses were already higher earners with more savings to begin with. The house didn't cause all of that gap, but some of it is real, and the piece that's real comes mostly from that forced, boring, automatic monthly savings that a renter has to recreate with pure self-control, and usually doesn't. So the honest way to think about it is this: the renter has the better math on paper and the worse odds in practice. The buyer has worse math on paper and a system that drags him to the finish line even if he's undisciplined. Which one describes you is a question only you can answer, and it matters more than the interest rate. And there's one more thing the spreadsheet buries that you'll feel in your bones by year 20. Dan's payment is frozen. The $2,020 in principal and interest he pays this year is the same $2,020 he pays 19 years from now, while everything around him gets more expensive. Ray's rent has no such ceiling. In my model, that $2,300 rent grows past $5,000 a month by year 20 and pushes towards $7,600 by year 30. Renting keeps you flexible, and flexibility is worth real money, but it also signs you up for a housing bill that climbs every single year for the rest of your life, with no finish line anywhere. Owning has a finish line. The year Dan makes his last payment and his housing cost drops to just taxes and upkeep, Ray is writing the biggest rent check of his life. That crossover is worth something the day you finally reach it. I've just made buying sound safe, so let me be equally hard on it. Because the people who skip this next part are the ones trying to sell you something. Buying is not the free lunch the homeowner camp implies. Start with break-even. Between the closing costs going in, the selling costs coming out, and those brutal, interest-heavy early years, buying a home usually doesn't pull ahead of renting and investing until somewhere around year 5 to 7 in a normal market. Buy a place and get transferred, divorced, or laid out of town in 3 years, and there's a very real chance you lost money versus having rented. Mobility has a price, and a house makes it expensive. Then there's concentration. Ray's money is spread across thousands of companies in every industry on the planet. Dan's entire net worth is jammed into one building, on one street, in one zip code, tied to one local economy. Ask anyone who owned in Detroit in 2006 or Las Vegas in 2008 what that feels like when the local market drops 30% and there's nothing they can do but wait and pray. Ray, in that same crash, just rebalances and moves on. Dan sits inside his one bet. And liquidity. Dan can't sell the guest bathroom to cover a medical emergency. His wealth is real, but it's locked in the walls, and the only ways to get at it are to sell the whole thing, paying to get out, or borrow against it at whatever rate the bank feels like charging that year. Ray can have his money in his account by Friday. When life goes sideways, and it does, that difference stops being theoretical. Oh, and about those selling costs. You've heard the rules changed. There was a big legal settlement in 2024 that was supposed to end the standard 6% commission. In practice, a year on, not much moved. Total commissions are still running around 5% in most places. They're just more negotiable now, and the buyer often signs a contract agreeing to pay their own agent. So when Dan eventually sells that house for, say, $800,000, he's still handing something like $30,000 to $40,000 to agents on the way out the door. Add it to the pile buying has to overcome. So let me stop hedging and give you the situations where the answer is genuinely clear, because there are some. Buying wins, and wins convincingly if you're going to stay put for at least 7 to 10 years. Time is what dissolves those transaction costs and lets the fixed payment become an advantage while everyone else's rent climbs around them. It wins if your local price-to-rent ratio is low, and that one is worth actually calculating, because it takes 30 seconds and tells you more than any thumbnail ever will. Take the price of a home you'd buy and divide it by a year's rent for a similar place. Our house is $400,000. A comparable rental is $2,300 a month, which is about $27,500 a year. $400,000 divided by that is roughly $14,500. As a rough rule, under 20 leans toward buying, over 25 leans toward renting. Dan and Ray sit around 14, which quietly favors owning in their particular neighborhood. In a pricey coastal city, that same house might rent for far less relative to its price, and the whole thing tips the other way. It wins if your rent is already close to what owning would cost, because then you're getting the forced savings almost for free. And it wins if you honestly know you're not the type to invest the difference, because the mortgage will save for you when you won't save for yourself. Renting wins just as clearly in the opposite conditions. If there's any real chance you'll move in the next 3 to 5 years, the transaction costs alone will probably sink buying before it starts. If your local price-to-rent ratio is up above 25, which describes a lot of expensive coastal cities, then renting and investing the difference tends to come out ahead even over long stretches, sometimes by a fortune. If you're at a stage where staying mobile actually grows your income, jumping cities for the better job, that flexibility has a dollar value that never shows up in the equity column. And renting wins if, and only if, you'll genuinely put that money to work every month and leave it alone through the ugly years. One more thing before the part that matters most, because this whole debate gets framed as a cage match, and it was never really one. Some of the smartest money moves I've watched live in the space between renting and buying. You can buy a modest place, well under what the bank swears you can afford, and keep investing on the side so you get the forced savings of a mortgage and a real portfolio instead of betting your whole future on one or the other. You can buy a 2-unit place, live in one half, rent out the other, and let a tenant cover most of your mortgage while you build the equity. People call that house hacking, and for the right person at the right age, it quietly wins both arguments at once. You can even rent in the expensive city you actually want to live in and own a cheaper place somewhere else that pays for itself. The pure rent versus buy question was always a bit of a false choice. The real skill isn't picking the winning team and defending it at dinner parties. It's building the version of this that fits the life you actually have, borrowing whatever pieces of each side happen to serve you. Notice what just happened. Every one of those tiebreakers came down to something about you, not something about the market. And that's the real answer to this whole debate. Forget which one wins on average, because you don't live on average. There are only 2 questions that decide this for you, and you have to answer both of them honestly, which is harder than it sounds. First, how long are you actually going to stay? Not how long you plan to, how long you really will, given how your life has actually gone so far. If the honest answer is under 5 years, you're probably a renter no matter what the market does. Second, if you rent, are you truly going to invest the difference? All of it, every month, through the crashes, for decades? Or is it going to quietly leak into a nicer life? If you're honest and the answer is that it'll leak, then buying's clumsy forced savings might genuinely build you more wealth than a renting strategy you'll never actually follow. Everything else, the appreciation rate, the year 20 balance, the perfect spreadsheet, all of it hangs off those 2 answers. The math doesn't decide this. What you'll actually do decides this, and you're the only one in the room who knows the truth about that. So before you let anyone, including me, tell you that renting is throwing money away or that buying is a trap, answer those 2 questions for yourself. Then you won't need anyone else's number. You'll have your own. I'm Gray. Money decisions made clear. I'll see you in the next one.